Hello, and welcome to Biology 122. In this first lecture, we're going to introduce some key definitions and concepts that will be important throughout the rest of the semester. Since the title of this course is Sensation and Perception, it's obviously important to understand what those terms mean, so let's begin with that. I'd like you to take a minute to consider these terms. What is meant by sensation, and what is meant by perception? Can you provide a definition of each? Do you know what kind of course you've signed up for? Just what is it that we are going to be studying this semester? Perhaps you're aware that sensation refers to the registration of physical stimuli on our sensory receptors, while perception refers to the process of creating a conscious perceptual experience from this sensory input. In other words, sensation can be thought of as the raw data regarding a stimulus, whether it be light waves, sound waves, or chemicals in our food, drinks, or even in the air, while perception is our interpretation of that raw data. Perceptions help us to make sense of the world around us. They allow us to understand what those light waves, sound waves, or chemicals mean. They help us to understand why these stimuli are important, or in some cases not important, and help us to decide how we should respond to them. In this illustration, we can see that something is occurring between the processes of sensation and perception, an additional and equally vital step. So it's important that we also define one additional term right here at the beginning of this semester, because we will be referring back to it along with the terms sensation and perception time and again for every sense we discuss. After energy from a stimulus activates receptors, we need to be able to encode that information in the form of an electrical signal, which can be sent along our nerves and into our central nervous system, where it can be decoded and interpreted as a meaningful perception. This intermediate step between sensation and perception is referred to as transduction. When discussing sensation, transduction, and perception, it's very important to keep in mind that how one person senses and perceives a stimulus is not necessarily the same as how another person senses and perceives that same stimulus. And it's equally important to realize that perception doesn't always reflect reality. Our interpretation of the raw data may not be accurate. This is why illusions are possible, and perhaps it helps to explain why so many people find illusions so captivating. Whether it be well-known illusions such as the "is it a rabbit or a duck?" work by famous artists whose mind-bending illustrations can be found in museums, works by more modern artists who draw in the streets to mess with our depth perception, or who draw on themselves and others, whether it be the face, hands, feet, or even the whole body. Work by artists who use shadows to play with our mind and cause us to see things that aren't really there. Or the photographs taken every day by ordinary people who create illusions using whatever is on hand, whether it be landmarks, people, mirrors, balloons, and even celestial objects. Or maybe even accidental illusions, where photos are simply taken at the wrong time, or as some people might say, at the right time. Humans are often fascinated by illusions, captivated by the experience of having our perceptions not match our expectations. But it's not just illusions that can cause our perceptions to not match with reality. Our senses are constantly being bombarded with information that we must analyze and make decisions about, often very quickly. Let's take, for instance, a very simple example of seeing a dark zigzag pattern out of the corner of your eye in the grass. The light has entered the eyes, been converted into a neural signal, which has been sent to the brain. But how do we interpret this zigzag pattern? Do we see it for what it really is, a hose that has suddenly been turned on, which has caused it to move slightly? Or do we perceive it as a snake approaching us and jump away from it? And I'd like you to take a minute to consider what factors might influence our perception in this situation. Would everyone perceive this experience in the same way? Are there any circumstances or prior experiences which might affect the way someone interprets this raw data? Do you think that, for instance, growing up in different areas may alter someone's perception in this situation? Would it matter if they lived in an area where there are no snakes, or in an area that has snakes but they are harmless, or in an area that has snakes that are poisonous and could cause serious harm? What about if this individual personally knew of someone who had been bitten by a poisonous snake and suffered the consequences? Or what about a child who has very few experiences to draw upon? A child who might be equally curious about a hose or a snake? A child who would not realize the dangers a snake might pose? What would their perception be? And would they respond differently than an adult? Clearly, our knowledge, fears, and previous experiences can influence our perceptions, and so this will be an important factor to take into consideration throughout this semester. Now, as we've just discussed, to have any perceptions take place at all, sensation must occur first. A stimulus must be detected by our sensory receptors. So, how many different types of sensory receptors do humans have? What kind of data are we taking in so that we can form perceptions? Or, more simply put, how many senses do humans have? Do you know the answer? Can you list them? You most likely said that humans have 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. This is, after all, what we are taught at school from a very young age. But it's not actually true. As you can see here, humans have far more than 5 senses, and this isn't even a complete list. One of the most important and overlooked is our sense of balance, which is largely made possible by our vestibular system. And an equally important and equally overlooked sense is proprioception, which is our ability to tell where our body is in space, and is made possible by receptors present in our muscles and joints. You may have also noticed on this list that there are quite a few senses which involve the skin. What is typically referred to simply as touch actually involves quite a few different senses, such as our ability to detect light touch versus deep pressure, or the ability to detect pain or feel itchy. And even our ability to detect temperature requires 2 different types of receptors for hot and cold. Along the same kinds of lines, some people even claim that each of the different receptor types responsible for our sense of smell should be counted as a separate sense, though others feel that this may be going a little overboard. And although we usually focus on those senses which tell us about the outside world, what about senses that inform us about what is occurring inside of our own bodies, such as those involved in hunger, or thirst, or the fact that our bladder is full? And what about ones we're not even consciously aware of? For example, the ability to sense and respond to changes in blood pressure or oxygen levels. These types of senses certainly won't be the focus of this course, but aren't they important senses as well? And consider the fact that sometimes we reference our sense of time and how it can feel as if it is going at different speeds. We certainly talk about it as if it's a physical sensation. So is it really a sense? Some people have made the argument that it is. So, as you can see, it's difficult to say precisely how many senses we have, given that it depends on exactly what our definition of a sense is. However, it's fair to say that we have at least a dozen, if not hundreds. And most importantly, it should be obvious that even if we don't include the internal senses, we clearly have more than the often cited 5 senses. At this point, I'd like you to take a minute to really think about each of your senses. Consider how much value you place on each one. Which do you consider the most important, and why? Which do you consider the least important? If you were forced to give one of them up, which sense would you pick, and why? How do you think the loss of this sense would impact your daily life? I'd like to encourage you to write down your answers in your notes so that you can refer to them at a later point. Feel free to pause the video if you want more time to think, and keep in mind that there's no right or wrong answer. I just want you to consider the questions, and I'm curious to see if at the end of the semester your opinions are still the same after learning more about sensation and perception. I suspect that some of your senses might actually be more important to your daily life than you typically give them credit for. I'd also like you to consider which sense you think creates and triggers the most vivid memories. Remarkably, almost everyone chooses the same one, but as we'll see later this semester, there's actually a biological reason for that. And how do you feel about the reliability of your senses? Are they all equally trustworthy? Which do you think is the most reliable and trustworthy? In other words, which sense is least likely to be fooled? And which do you think is the least reliable and trustworthy? In other words, which sense is most likely to be fooled? We've seen quite a few examples of optical illusions in this lecture already, and those do tend to be the types of illusions people are most familiar with. But is vision the only sense that can be tricked? Based on the way I'm asking this question, you can probably guess that the answer is no. Vision is not the only sense that can be tricked. The truth is that none of our senses are entirely trustworthy. They can all be fooled, as we will see throughout this semester. When discussing the various senses, it's also important to keep in mind that although we tend to think of each sense, each modality, as entirely separate, this often isn't the case. I'm sure you've heard the expression that no man is an island. Well, no sense is an island either. Multimodal, or multisensory integration, is a common phenomenon which involves the integration, the combination, of information from various senses, from various modalities. We often use as many senses as possible to try to create a mental representation of the things that we encounter. We want that mental representation to be as complete as possible. So something as simple as experiencing a cup of hot coffee actually involves quite a few senses. Not only the taste and the smell, but the feel and sight of it as well. Maybe even the sound of it brewing or being poured into a mug. Furthermore, the taste, smell, sight, sound, and feel of that hot cup of coffee all get integrated together in our memories. Therefore, if we are exposed to just a single sensory component at a later point, we can often access all of those various sense memories together to once again form that complete mental representation. For example, just the smell of coffee will often allow us to call to mind the rich taste of it, the dark color of it, perhaps lightened by cream depending on our preference, and the feel of the warm mug in our hand as we sip from it. The fact is, we make far more of these connections between various senses than we even tend to realize. For example, do you know that most people can tell the difference between hot water and cold water based only on the sound it makes when it's poured? Don't believe me? You can try it for yourself by watching this video available on YouTube. Unfortunately, I'm unable to get other videos to play within my own video, so please pause this video here and use the link I've provided, or go to the additional required videos folder where I have embedded it and play it directly in Blackboard. Please realize that I have absolutely no control over these additional videos, so if this video, or any other videos throughout the semester, can no longer be accessed because it has been removed from YouTube or other websites, please let me know and I will try my best to find an alternate video. So, were you able to tell the difference? Pretty amazing, right? It's important to realize that based on our previous experiences, we often have expectations about one sense based on another sense because of this multimodal integration. For example, just by looking at a floor surface, we can predict what the texture and temperature of carpet will feel like as compared to hardwood floors or tiles. And we know just by looking at it that if we drop a coin or walk in shoes with a hard heel on these various floor surfaces, that it will result in different sounds. This may not seem like it's very important, or even useful, but our ability to make these types of connections and predictions allow us to more easily interact with the world around us. For instance, it's important we learn to associate the sound of a word with what an object looks like, or even how it feels, tastes, smells, or sounds, or we wouldn't be able to communicate efficiently. And what about associating certain sounds with letters? How would we read without that connection being made? And think about how useful it is to be able to associate the sound of voice with the appearance of our family and friends. These connections between various senses even help to keep us safe, too. It's important that we learn that the red glow of a stovetop indicates that it's hot and that it is painful to touch, without having to actually touch it. As we will discuss in more detail in a future lecture, a large portion of our brain is dedicated to multimodal association. Although each sense is initially received by a particular region of the brain, this is often not the only location in which this information is ultimately processed. Rather than keeping information regarding each sense in an entirely separate location, isolated from the information about other senses, the brain actually purposely brings information from various modalities together in the same location so that integration can occur. However, because of this integration, it's also possible for one sense to influence another sense and cause our perceptions to once again not match with reality. Amazingly, what we see can sometimes alter how we perceive the taste and smell of something, or even fool us into thinking that we heard something different than we actually did. This phenomenon may seem odd, but consider the fact that sometimes we receive conflicting information from our various senses, and we need to resolve this conflict to form a perception. This often requires that we fuse the conflicting information together or choose to give priority to one sense over another. We've already mentioned that no sense is entirely trustworthy. Well, just as you deemed some of your senses as more reliable than others, our brains often make these same determinations without our conscious knowledge. Let's look at some examples. Multiple studies have shown time and again that the appearance of food and drink can alter our perception of its taste and smell. In one study, subjects were served what appeared to be a normal-looking plate of steak and French fries. However, the room had been installed with special lighting that changed how the color of the food appeared. Under this lighting effect, the participants thought the steak and fries tasted fine. But once the lighting was returned to normal, it was revealed that the steak was actually blue in color, and the French fries were green. Upon seeing this, many of the subjects lost their appetite, and some even became physically ill. In a similar type of study, participants were asked to taste and describe various wines. Unknown to them, one of the white wines was given to them a second time, but this time with red food coloring in it. Upon tasting the white wine with red food coloring, participants completely changed their description of the wine compared to how they described it without the food coloring. Moreover, their descriptions of this white wine with red food coloring included terms typically reserved for red wines, not white wines. Remarkably, this effect was still observed even when the participants were professional wine tasters. These individuals had devoted significant portions of their lives to studying wines, and in fact, the entire purpose of their job required them to be able to distinguish the subtle differences between one type of wine and another. Surely, if anyone should have been able to tell that a white wine was masquerading as a red wine, it should have been them, but they often couldn't. As previously mentioned, what we see can also influence what we hear. In one study, participants were shown one of 4 staged videos of a man chasing a woman, while a bystander yelled either, "He's got your boot," or "He's gonna shoot." Depending on whether the video showed the man holding a gun or a boot, this often altered what the participants reported that they heard. For example, if the video showed the man holding a gun while chasing the woman, many participants reported hearing "He's gonna shoot," even if the bystander had been yelling, "He's got your boot." In this case, the sense of sight was given priority over the sense of sound. However, in other cases, the conflicting visual and auditory information was fused together. If the video showed the man holding a boot while chasing the woman, but the bystander yelled, "He's gonna shoot," some participants reported hearing, "He's got your shoe." Clearly an attempt to resolve the conflicting information, a way to justify why they had heard the sh sound of shoot, but saw someone holding a boot, similar to a shoe, instead of a gun. Now, because one sense can alter our perception of another sense, this makes it possible for yet another form of illusions, ones that involve multiple senses. A classic example of this type of illusion is known as the Mcgurk Effect. There are multiple versions of this illusion, but all of them involve examples of vision influencing what we hear. There's a video available on YouTube that demonstrates one version of this illusion that I strongly encourage you to watch. Please once again pause this video and either use the link I've provided or go to the additional required videos folder to access it. And as I previously mentioned, please let me know if at some point the video is no longer available. Pretty weird, right? As you hopefully saw, in this version of the Mcgurk Effect, the visual information is given priority over the auditory information. And it's pretty amazing that even once you're aware of the illusion, that it still works. We're still convinced that the person is saying fa, fa, fa with an F, as in Florida, even though we know that the person is saying ba, ba, ba with a B, as in Boston. I wish that the video allowed more time for you to see the two different visual components side by side, because I feel that the fact that you can look back and forth between the two while the same soundtrack is playing and have the sound flip-flop on you is the most convincing aspect of the persistence of this illusion. So feel free to go back and watch that portion of the video again if you agree with me that they really didn't give you enough time to fully appreciate it. This image depicts another example of the Mcgurk Effect. As is described, if the visual component of a video shows someone saying ga, ga with a G, as in Georgia, but the auditory portion of the video is of someone saying ba, ba with a B, as in Boston, then someone watching the video will report hearing da, da with a D, as in Denver. This time, the conflicting visual and auditory information results in a fusion of the two, rather than just giving priority to the visual over the auditory, as we saw in the example in the video. Regardless of how the conflicting information is resolved, it's clear that sometimes our perceptions for at least one of our senses is not going to match with reality. However, it's important to remember that despite these errors that sometimes occur, the ability to integrate the information from multiple senses is vitally important. So, although we will spend the majority of this semester discussing each of the major senses in isolation, always keep in mind that this really isn't the case, and that multimodal integration is occurring on a regular basis. Lastly, I'd like to finish up this lecture by pointing out that, for some people, multiple senses can be even more closely associated with one another than they are for the rest of us. Synesthesia is a condition in which a stimulus in one modality consistently triggers a response in another modality. For example, some people might taste words, and others might see sounds as different colors. This isn't a disease, rather it's just a different way of perceiving stimuli. There's a short but interesting video about synesthesia available on YouTube that I would encourage you to watch. Please once again pause this video and either use the link I've provided or go to the additional required videos folder to access it. That brings us to the end of this first lecture video. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of just what it is that we are going to be studying this semester in this sensation and perception course. Personally, I find this topic absolutely fascinating, and I sincerely hope that you find it at least somewhat interesting as well. If you have any questions about the material presented in this lecture or any other lecture, please email me. And I would encourage you not to wait until the last minute, because if you do, then I might not be able to respond to you in time before the module closes. I look forward to working with you this semester.